I'm going to sew this flying geese block with using foundation paper piecing. And so I'm going to walk you through in real time how I make this block. You can print this PDF off on my blog. I'll have the link below. Here are some tools that is very handy to have when paper piecing. A rotary cutter, a ruler. This ruler is great because you can see a 1/4 inch seam line right through it. It's very easy. Otherwise, you can have some sort of a ruler that measures a 1/4 inch. Is very handy when paper piecing. I have some coordinating fabrics. I wasn't sure what I was going to use. And then it is handy to have an iron and an ironing mat next to your workspace. And I'll link the one that I used below. And of course, scissors and a seam ripper are also handy to keep close to your workstation. So today the pattern that I'm using is just one block. We're not joining any pieces together. So all of our letters on this paper are A. I'll explain that a little more in a second. Right now I'm trying to decide what size my pieces need to be that I'm going to work with today so that I can cut out my scrap pieces. So I'm measuring from that light line on the outside of the box. There's a smaller box inside a bigger box. When you cut out the pattern, cut out on that really thin line, that larger box, that has your seam allowances in it. I didn't cut along that line today because I wanted you to be able to see that other line, and that other line is for your seam allowance. So this is going to be a finished 6x6 quilt block, and there's a 1/4 inch seam around the whole thing so that you can either piece multiple blocks together or you can have a finished 6x6 block to use for something. So I'm starting out and I'm going to go ahead and cut each of these rectangles. These are going to be my large rectangles that will turn into the actual flying geese pieces. I'm going to cut those out first. Another tip, you can see that my rotary cutting blade is a little bit dull, is when you're cutting out paper, it automatically dulls your scissors, your rotary cutter, your sewing pins. So if you use anything with foundation paper piecing on a regular basis, just know that you might want to keep a separate set of those tools just for cutting with paper. So the sewing pins that we're going to use with our paper are going to get duller. So keep those separate from all your other sewing supplies so that you know when you're going to be paper piecing, you can use those in that scenario. That way you're not always dulling your nice pins and needles and rotary blades. Okay, so these rectangles that I'm cutting out, I am making sure they are at a minimum of 6.5 inches wide. That is just barely cutting it. So I want these to be 7 inches wide. And if you want to get any sort of fussy cut, you're probably going to want it to be wider than that. But the pieces I'm cutting out today are 4 inches tall by 6.5 inches wide. And really, those pieces could be even that 4 inches. It really probably should be a 4.5 inch tall by 7 inches wide, because 4 inches is just right, just enough. So you can see my pieces are going to be a little bit smaller, but I'm going to recommend that you cut out 2 rectangles that are 4.5 inches tall by 7 inches wide. Now I am going to go ahead and pick out the fabric that I'm going to use for those smaller triangles in the corner. And if you want to piece multiple blocks, together, you should know that this little rectangle, if you use a solid fabric, you can piece these together and it will look like another flying geese. You can make it look like a chevron. So if you do like a really patterned fabric, you're going to see that seam when you line up the two pieces together. But if you use solids or something like I'm using, it has a print, but it's a very, there's a word for it, minimal print. I'm sure I'm not coming up with the right word. Maybe I'll think of it and put it in the description. But I'm going to go ahead and iron all my pieces. I want them to be nice and flat. If you have really wrinkly fabric, so if your fabric's been in the scrap bin for a long time, iron it before you cut them out. That way you make sure your pieces are big enough. You wouldn't want to start working on your project and then find out your fabric isn't big enough for the triangles that you need to make. So I wanted to show you real quick on a foundation paper piecing pattern that has multiple letters. So this is an example where it has A, 1 through however many numbers it needs, B, 1 through however many numbers it needs, and C, you can obviously see there's 3 triangles there. So C is through 1 through 3. So what you would do to build this piece is you'll cut those 3 rectangles, A, B, and C apart, and then you'll work individually on each letter. So you would start with A, make sure you go in order. So A1 is your first piece. Then you'll connect A1 to A2. And once you've connected those 2 pieces, you do A3 and so on. Once you get all your A's done, then you do all your B's, and then you connect them together on that line, on that seam line. It's a 1/4 inch seam. And the same with your C. But today we're not going to use multiple letters because we are only going to build this one 6-inch block. Now, if you want to connect this 6-inch block with more, you just have to print more of these papers and do it that way. So that's why there's only 1 letter on this. So I'm going to show you from the very start. We're turning our pattern upside down because I want you to understand when you build this foundation paper piecing block, you're building it on the opposite side. So we want that first piece, our A1 is going to face outward. So the raw edge or the back side of the fabric is going to go against the back side of our pattern. Now when we're adding the next piece, we're going to make sure we go to A2. And this is important because there's a lot of patterns where if you don't go in the right order, they're not going to match up right. A2 and A3 are virtually the same in this pattern, but not every pattern is going to be that way. So this is a light box that I'm using. This light box actually belongs to my son, which is why there's little prongs on the side because he uses it for his flip books. So I don't want to take it off. That's why that's on there, and we're just going to work around it today. So I'm going to go ahead and take this square fabric. You can see I'm accidentally putting it on A3, but I'll catch my mistake here in just a second and move it over to A2 because I want to show you guys that it's really easy to not pay attention and add the wrong thing to the wrong place. So just pay attention to what you're doing, pay attention to your numbers, and don't lose track of where you are. That's why I left this in the video because I wanted you to see this. Okay, now that we're working on the right side between A1 and A2, we're going to do that line right there. That's going to be the seam between those 2 numbers. We're lining up our square And I'm going to go ahead and pin along that seam line. That dark line is our seam line. And what I'm doing is I'm pinning along that line, and this just helps me to see where the piece is actually going to go. So let's flip it over, and we're going to fold the top of that corner down. So the two pieces, that corner on the top is going to be our actual piece that's going to finish our block. So that top corner that we brought down has to make sure that it's a 1/4 inch around the sewing line so that we know we have enough fabric in that seam. And that includes that seam line that goes all across the bottom of A4. That top corner needs to be at least long enough that it'll go past that dark line. So now we're going to take it to the sewing machine, and we are going to sew on that diagonal line between A1 and A2. When it comes to sewing foundation paper piecing, it is really helpful to change your stitch length to a shorter stitch length. If you have a machine that has numbers, 0.7, or is it 0.07? Mine's a dial, so I just turn it down a little bit. I usually have my stitch length about 1.5. So test it out and see what you're the most comfortable with. But the purpose of that is to help you tear the paper off at the end. And you want to hold that seam together really well. So you don't want your stitches to be too far apart that the seam won't hold together when you rip that paper off. I'm using a little scrap of fabric just to keep my threads from being cut too short and constantly having to rethread my machine because I'm going back and forth and stitching these tiny little lines. So that's why I do that. So now I'm going to go ahead and use my iron at this point just to show you what it's going to look like finished. But when I'm doing the other corners, the other pieces, I'm going to trim them off first before I iron it. But I just wanted to see how that looked. Make sure that piece is long enough that it covers all those, that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance inside those lines. Let's flip it over to the front. We're going to make sure our right sides are together on the front. So the triangle we ironed down needs to be folded back up because we don't want to trim it off. We want to fold that back up. And what we want to trim off are those edges that are at the bottom. So our right sides together are the pieces we want to keep. Those two pieces at the bottom we want to trim off because we want that to be a 1/4 inch seam from that seam that we just sewed. The more that you do foundation paper piecing, the more comfortable you'll get with using smaller pieces. If this is your first paper piecing project, I want you to use larger pieces. Like don't try to cut them too small to where they exactly fit. Give yourself a 1/2 inch larger, than not so much bigger that you have too big of a piece to work with, but enough, like a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch larger so you have plenty of space. So we're going to use that light table. You can see through the light table that 1/4 inch seam between A1 and A2 that we just trimmed. Let's go ahead and line up our A3 piece, and keep in mind that that top corner has to be long enough that it will fold down and cover the seam between A3 and A4 and that seam allowance on the side of the block. And this is just a little tip that I find helpful every time I do paper piecing. is to pin along that seam line just to see how it's going to look after it's sewed before I sew it. So I'm going to fold it down, and I'm just eyeballing it to see, okay, that's going to make it past the side, the line on the side seam, and the seam on the bottom. Then I know, okay, I can sew that seam and it will be in boundary. So let's go ahead and sew that diagonal line between A1 and A3 and keep your stitch length shorter, so don't adjust it until your foundation paper piecing is all done. You can see my cat's tail in the corner. When he wants his lovies, he's always hanging around me. When he is tired and wants to sleep, he's nowhere to be found. I digress. I'm using that little scrap of fabric just to kind of hold my threads to keep them from me cutting them too short and having to rethread my machine. And I think it also saves thread. But sometimes when I go ahead and start sewing, I have to turn my sewing machine knob to kind of loosen those threads when I first switch to the project, so that it doesn't pull those two pieces together. And I don't know if that makes sense, but if you want to use a leader like that, you might understand after doing it a few times. Okay, so again, the top triangle, the top of the square that's going to become a triangle is the part where we want to keep. So let's fold our pattern back on that line that we just sewed. We're going to keep that square lined up so that we don't cut it in our seam. And then those extra pieces are extra fabric in the seam we want to trim off. We want to make sure we have a 1/4 inch in that seam so we don't lose, so our seam doesn't rip out. And then fold it over, and you can finger press this down. You don't have to use a hot iron. But I feel like when I'm doing foundation paper piecing, it has that nice, crisp, ironed. If I want something that's really nice and crisply ironed, then I want to have my iron next to me. If I'm doing something that won't really matter if I iron it at the end, then I'll finger press it. Okay, so now we have the top triangle finished. We're going to add the second rectangle of fabric that's going to be that second rectangle. I'm just showing you that my llamas are going in 2 different directions. So this print, it doesn't matter which direction I put it. It can go the same direction or it can go opposite. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that I have enough fabric. See, this one is, when I was telling you at the beginning to cut it a little bit wider or taller, cut this one at 4.5 inches. This is cut at 4 inches, and I'm having to be a little bit careful about where I place it to make sure that there is enough fabric to cover all the seams. And you'll see that here in just a minute after I pin this in place and fold it down. It's not quite long enough to cover the seam allowance at the bottom. Can you see that little gap at the very bottom? I want that to be longer so that has more seam allowance. Because see how much I'm going to cut off from where the pins are? That's more than 1/4 inch. So I have to be really, I have to get this one really close to the right length because it's cut shorter. So when you cut yours, cut them at 4.5 inches tall by 7 inches wide to make sure you have that room. Okay, so I'm going to use that same trick of folding my paper on that seam line. We're going to do that seam line right there. And you can see already in the seam, I have more than 1/4 inch of that orange fabric. So I'm not going to line up my piece right on that orange fabric. I'm going to make sure it hangs over at least 1/4 inch from where the paper's folded. So that's the trick that I'm doing right here. I'm kind of eyeballing it. Once I kind of think, okay, that is probably a good amount, 1/4 inch, we're going to pin that piece on the seam line, and then I'm going to fold it down again to make, because I want to fold it down again before I sew it to make sure it's where it needs to be. You can go ahead and sew it, but if you have to rip out paper piecing pieces, it is a pain. First off, your stitch length is shorter, so you have a lot more tight stitches to rip out. See, now it covers that white space at the bottom. So we know there's going to be plenty of fabric that's going to be able to fit in that seam on the bottom, just by adjusting it just a little bit. So now we're going to take this to the sewing machine. It is possible. You can rip out foundation paper piecing seams because it happens. And I know it's happened to me, especially when I was just getting started. But if I don't have to, if I can, it's kind of like measure twice, cut once. It's that same idea. So you're double checking it twice so that you can sew it once. That's the basic idea of what's behind there. I'm going to trim off my scrap piece that held my thread for me, and I'm going to stitch straight on that line. Take my pins out. I like having my pins because they hold that fabric right where I want it to be, because I've already tested out to make sure that's exactly where I want that to be. I did backstitch. You don't have to backstitch if you're using a shorter stitch length. It's kind of a habit, so I just do it. Trim that off. We're going to take that over to the cutting table. And now we're going to fold that pattern back again and trim off 1/4 inch seam. So we'll fold that pattern back on that seam line. And you can see that the edges don't match, but that doesn't really matter. But we're going to go ahead and trim it down to 1/4 inch seam allowance. As long as you have 1/4 inch seam allowance, it doesn't matter how much extra you have of another piece. You can always trim it down. Now we're going to go ahead and take the iron and iron that piece flat. And then we'll start adding the next piece. So that's a 4. So the next piece we'll add is a 5, which is one of the corner triangles at the bottom. We're going to add it just like we did on the top. So we're going to go ahead and place it right sides together. Flip it over. For these large squares, you don't really need that light pad, but on the next one, I'm going to cut a little piece off the edge and just kind of show you what it's like to use a scrap piece. I just want you to be comfortable doing the paper piecing before you start using smaller pieces. So you can kind of see if you wanted to move that, save a little extra fabric, move that up. That's how much of, I'm just showing where you would cut it. So let's pin it right here. And I'll pull that corner down after it's all pinned, like I have for every other one, and show how you want to have, then you're going to have extra fabric there on the top of the square to pull over to the bottom. So you're going to have plenty of fabric in your seam. Let's take this piece to the sewing machine and sew along that line. Okay, now we're going to the sewing machine and we're sewing that diagonal line between A4 and A5. And we only have one more seam to sew after this one to finish our block. So we're going to go ahead and sew along this seam. Once that's done, I'm going to trim off the excess out of the seam. And then we'll add the last piece to the block. So we're going to fold our pattern back. Make sure our fabric is facing right sides together. Trim off the extra fabric in the seam using some kind of a tool that will measure at least 1/4 inch. You could even probably make I know there are tools that have a little lip on them that measures off 1/4 inch that are really handy. And now we're going to iron that down. And now we have one piece left to add. And I want to turn this last piece into a scrap. So I'm going to cut off the edge of the square just so you can kind of get a feel for the idea of using your scrap pieces to make foundation paper piecing, to use up some of your scrap pieces for this project. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just going to cut off that corner. So we're going to pretend this is a piece I got out of my scrap box. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to line this up. Okay, we're going to take our light box, and you can hold this up to a window. You can use a flashlight. The light box is really easy, but I have used a window a lot in the past, so that's very possible. Okay, so I'm folding my pattern back so I can see that seam, and that piece, you can see how much it overlaps because you can see through that top layer because of the light table. And eyeballing it, it's definitely over 1/4 inch. You could also measure it and then you'd know for sure. But we can do my favorite trick, which is pinning right on that sewing line. And then flipping it over and folding it over where you would sew on that line. And and making sure that it covers, and it definitely covers. There's plenty of fabric. And that's a way you can use up your scraps or save fabric. Then we just take that to the sewing machine, stitch along that line between A4 and A6. And I've already got it stitched here. I'm going to turn it over, and then we're going to go ahead and trim that seam. We're going to trim it down to 1/4 inch. You can see we don't have near as much fabric on that little scrap piece that we used, but it is enough. We're just not trimming off half of a square, basically. I think the thing that I love about foundation paper piecing is that I can get those triangles perfect if I'm just following the paper pattern. I don't have to make sure my pieces are cut out perfect. I mean, you still have to sew it straight and iron it. It's easier for me to make sure those corners and those crisp triangles happen when I'm using foundation paper piecing. Okay, so now we're going to trim our block. And this piece of paper is a second pattern that I put together. So I cut out my pattern on the small line, which is when I talked about at the very beginning. That small line is measured out at 1/4 inch all the way around. So that means your square is going to measure a 6.5 by 6.5 with those seam allowances built in. So I cut it out on that line so that when I'm using my rotary cutter, I am not cutting the paper. And you'll see with my original one, which is this one here, I did not cut out on that thin line because I wanted to show you that line. I wanted you to see that that was the seam allowance line. So this is going to dull my rotary blade a little more. I think I'll probably need to switch it out after this project. The trick is if I have one in my sewing room, someone might have to go shopping soon. Okay, so I went ahead and made a second piece because I want to show how you join two pieces together. Because you'll probably want to join this finished 6-inch block with something. So if you decide to make multiple blocks of this pattern, and see how if you join those two together, it almost looks like another triangle. So then if you had several in a row, it could look like a nice little chevron pattern going on, especially if you used solid fabrics. Okay, so we're gonna use clips this time. They're just easier to hold together. Oh, and I'm also showing an example of, depending on which way you decide to put it, you could even put the pieces facing each other so that the arrows are pointing at each other. It's however you want to build it. Today I'm going to build it side by side so it turns out to be more of a chevron. So we're going to line these two pieces up. We know they're exactly the same, and we're going to use clippies this time because we've got 2 layers of paper and 2 layers of fabric, and these are great for doing this kind of thing. And now we're going to sew along that seam. I started at the top because I'm joining 2 pieces. And I'm back stitching to make sure they don't fall apart. And then I'm following that line all the way down. You are going through several layers of fabric, so just take your time, especially when you're at those corners. I backstitched at the bottom. Now I'm going to use my little scrap piece, trim it off. You can have multiple scrap pieces if you like that method. Okay, now we're going to open it up and I'm going to show you how perfectly they line up. I just have a little thread in my seam, but see, that creates a chevron pattern. And if you use so you want to make sure you're not using like striped fabric for those little corner triangles, because then your stripes wouldn't match up. Or it'd be really hard to make your stripes match up. You want something that's an overall print and kind of is disguisable. So this is the fun part of foundation paper piecing. This is the part where you take your project and you go sit in the recliner and you watch your favorite show and you pull off all the paper. You have a trash can next to you. And you don't want to pull off the paper until you've connected your pieces all together. So if you're going to do like a whole quilt top, you kind of want to wait until your whole quilt top is built. Or if you can connect 4 of these together in a large square, and it could be a 12 by 12 inch pillow form you could make. So there's a lot of different things you can do with it. You could make like a sampler quilt, and we can keep making 6-inch blocks, and we can do all kinds of different block types. And maybe that is a good idea to do for a series. So don't be surprised if you see that coming in the future. Making a sampler quilt with all these foundation blocks, because I've got a few up my sleeve. I really do like foundation paper piecing. I find that you either really like it or you don't. I think I like it more than traditional piecing. This is where it helps to have those tight stitches to make sure you don't accidentally pull out any threads. You do not want to take your piece apart just by removing the paper. Now I'm just going to give it a quick iron, and we are done building that block and connecting it to the other one. Subscribe if you like this video, and click the bell for notifications on when you get more videos. Thanks for watching, guys.